Scarlet stood before the court, an attorney in a suit, swore an oath to tell the truth. Scarlet wrote about
Los Muchachos, The Boys, Willy Falcone and Salvador Magluta. Have you all seen the new documentary series on Netflix called Cocaine Cowboys, The Kings of Miami by Billy Corben, Alfred Spellman, and Dave Sipian? If you have not, you need to pause this podcast and go watch that series. You won't be able to stop. You'll binge it. It's so good. It's about the rise and fall of the biggest cocaine traffickers in history, Willy and Sal. And it goes through the many legal dramas, the trials galore. There are so many great trial stories. And today I have the pleasure of speaking to Billy and Alfred, who made this great series and who also happened to produce this podcast. We have a great time talking about all of the ins and outs, the players, the trial lawyers, prosecutors, defense lawyers, what happens, how the case gets tried, and I'm not going to spoil it for you if you haven't watched it yet. So go watch it and then listen to this discussion. I think you'll really enjoy hearing about the ins and outs of the Willy and Sal trial and the drama. In For the Defense next, I get to speak with Billy and Alfred. Stay tuned.
he shuffled out in shame, yet no one.
So welcome, Billy Corben and Alfred Spellman. It's a real pleasure of mine to get to introduce my friends and speak to my friends from over 20 years now. And they're the producers of this podcast. So we get the double whammy of the producers of the podcast, but more importantly, they've made a great series about Willy and Sal, Los Muchachos, the boys. I get to speak to the current boys, the current muchachos of Miami, Billy and Al. And let's talk about Cocaine Cowboys, the Kings of Miami. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us. Thank you for establishing all the conflicts of interest up front.
Of course, that's what I do. That's what I do, Billy. So the first trial really had everything. And I'm going to assume that folks have watched the show. If you haven't, watch it and then listen to the podcast. But the first trial literally had every possible thing we could have. All-star defense team, snitches, drugs, money, sex, acquittals, bribed jurors, biting strippers. You could have spent 6 episodes just on the 91 trial, the 91 case. So I imagine there was a lot of great stories that didn't make it into the series. So can you tell us some of the really great stuff that didn't make it in? Anything that stands out?
Well, I'll say that, we are, so just to establish our bona fides here, neither Billy or I went to law school, but in a lot of ways, this case was our criminal law education. 916060 can be taught, it should be taught as a case study in law schools for how to try a case, or in certain instances, I guess, how not to try a case. It was the only case that I'd ever read the full trial transcript of. And I was just fascinated by it. I remember going down to the clerk's office and saying, I need to get the full transcript of a trial. And they're like, okay, what is it? I said, well, it's an older case from 1991. The guy looks at me and goes, 916060? I go, yeah. So that code, that case number is famous down in the clerk's office. And there was just seeing the dream team, it's important to kind of put this in time and place. And we do it in the doc, but I think it's just important to kind of level set here. This trial started 2 weeks after the O.J. Simpson acquittal. And the entire country basically spent 10 months watching a first-degree murder case unfold on television like a soap opera. Billy and I remember we were in 11th grade, I guess going into 12th grade, at the time of the OJ trial. And we were OJ trial junkies. We were in high school making short films together, but you'd run home from school to catch the OJ trial. And so, having this trial begin on the heels of that, criminal defense attorneys at that point, you had Johnny Cochran, your F. Lee Bailey, your Robert Shapiro were either reviled by a section of the country or beloved by a section of the country, or people I think like Billy and I were just like impressed with the criminal defense trial lawyers. So this trial kind of starting on the heels of that, when you read the transcript, I think it's just kind of important to keep that in your head, because I think everything that unfolded in this trial, or a lot of that unfolded in this trial, was in one way or another kind of affected by the perception of the OJ trial. And I think to a large extent, the jurors' perception of how the evidence was presented in this case was affected by the OJ trial.
And I think it's also important to remember that Willy and Sal allegedly spent about $25 million on their defense in this case from 91 through the mid to late 1990s. And so there were attorneys and there were associates and there were paralegals, there were PIs, lots and lots of PIs, and an extraordinary amount of legitimate legal work and private investigation work went into this case, to the point where I think in many of the cross-examinations, it's clear that the criminal defense attorneys knew more about the government's witnesses than the government themselves knew. I mean, it was really quite everybody talks about the dream team of the O.J. Simpson trial, and having a defendant that could financially kind of equal or at least take on the state of California. And here, I mean, I don't know what the U.S. government spent pursuing that first prosecution, but Willy and Sal spent $25 million. So if there were a defendant that could take on the United States government, it was clearly these guys.
I wonder how that $25 million compares to what OJ spent on his dream team. I bet it was close.
Oh, you think that Naked Gun money really added up there?
Yeah, it probably did. I was in law school at the time in Dershowitz's class during the OJ trial. I was fascinated with that one too, but we got to watch that one on TV. We didn't get to watch this one on TV. It made a big difference for how it was covered. Of course, we had to rely on Jim DeFeet's New Times articles from the trial every day. I think it makes a big difference, obviously, the TV versus non-TV portion of it. That's why your documentary is so important, I think.
Well, this is one of the challenges we've had. There are lots of stories that we'd love to tell, but obviously federal court cases, there's no coverage for it. One of the things when Billy and I look at subjects to make a doc about, it's always, well, what are we going to be seeing? Right? I mean, it's a visual medium. So when people are telling stories, you have to see something. And so one of the challenges we knew early on here is we knew that there were going to be three trials, right? It was, 91, 66, both the first and the second Magluta trials, and then the Moya trial. And so having 3 federal trials and 6 episodes presented a very unique challenge to us as documentary filmmakers. And addressing that, we kind of bounced around a bunch of ideas and how we would deal with it. And ultimately, would we do animations that would reenact particular sections of the trial, or cross-examinations, or opening and closing statements. So there was a lot of thought given to it before we kind of landed on where we landed, which was essentially hiring an extremely talented courtroom sketch artist named Jerome Lemeneau, who was in the 80s and 90s flown around the country by network news teams to cover trials. He did the whole Noriega trial. And we reached him. He was teaching art in a suburb of Detroit, high school art. And we got in touch with him. He's retired now. We said, listen, would you like to do some sketches for this documentary? We're going to animate these courtroom sketches. And he was all in. So it was a great thrill to work with somebody as talented as Jerome. And I think the treatment ended up working out pretty cool.
I loved the animations. It freaked me out at first when I saw the eyes starting to blink. I was thrown back, but I loved it and thought it was great.
No offense to the hardworking courtroom sketch artists of the country, but for a lot of them, their style is such that there's not a great or more than a passing resemblance to some of the participants. In fact, some of them look like that lady who painted over the Jesus painting, some of them have absolutely no resemblance whatsoever. So we had to find an artist whose style was such that it didn't look like caricatures, but it looked like the actual people. So we wouldn't confuse the audience and everybody would know, okay, this is Albert Krieger, and this is Roy Black, and this is Sal Magluta, and this is Willy Falcone. And so Jerome was perfect for it. And then we just kind of brought them to life a little bit. So you felt like you were in the courtroom during the federal trial.
Loved it. Billy, is this the most Miami of your films or no?
Someone accurately described it on Twitter as unapologetically Miami. Right. Probably every frame of the images and every beat of the soundtrack, unapologetically Miami.
Great. So I want to talk about who I think is the greatest of all time, not just in Miami, but but in the country as the criminal defense lawyer, as the GOAT, Albert Krieger. He's no longer with us. I miss the guy a lot. Wonderful man, lawyer, father, husband, great guy. I want to know, how did you get him to come on? Because it wasn't easy to get some of these guys to speak, and to get Albert to come on must have been tricky.
I'll start. So I went to high school at New World School of the Arts with Albert Krieger's grandchildren, Zach Lewis, Cammie Lewis, and Nina Lewis. And their mother, Claudia Lewis, is Albert Krieger's daughter. And so I called Claudia. That was the first thing I did, and said, we want to interview your father for this documentary. And she helped connect us. But it wasn't going to be a simple phone request. Albert summoned us, Alfred and I, to his home, where he and his wife effectively auditioned us to determine whether or not he would agree to this interview. And it was intense. It was the Socratic method.
It was very intimidating. We go down to Albert's condo. I think it was in Deering Bay at the time. And we go down there and we meet with him and his lovely wife, and we're sitting there in the living room, and Albert's, we're kibitzing about the case and going back and forth. And, finally, we'd love to interview you, for this documentary that we're making. And by this point, I think the U had come, Cocaine Cowboys had already come out, obviously. The U had come out, I think, by this point. So we had a little bit of a reputation as, that we were capable, but obviously this was quite a sensitive case. And as you point out, we had been turned down by some of the other lawyers involved by this point. So, but Albert was definitely somebody we really, really wanted. He takes a long look at Billy and I, and he says, well, I tell you what, he says, do you know what the Bill of Rights are? And I was like, well, sure. They're the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And he says, if you can tell me all 10 of the Bill of Rights, tell me what they are, I will agree to do the interview. Now, again, Billy and I are not, we have never been to law school. We are, a little bit of armchair amateur lawyers. We get a kick out of a lot of true crime content. We're a little bit of aficionados, but by no means constitutional law scholars. But something kicked over in my brain. I went into kind of the 1,000-yard stare, and I said, well, the First Amendment, we all know, is religion, and press, and assembly, and 2 is right to bear arms, 3 is quartering soldiers, 4 is a warrantless search and seizure, 5 is self-incrimination, right, trial by jury, and I just rattled them all off. Even got 9 right, which I never get right because it's always kind of conflated with 10. It seems kind of weird at the end. So neither are kind of like real things. So I got all 10. I think Albert was too. And that, to this day, that is one of the most precious memories of working on a project or getting somebody to agree to something professionally. That stands out. That's definitely top 5.
And true to his word, he did it. He did the interview because Alfred named all 10 amendments of the Bill of Rights like that.
So Alfred is the Sal of the group, and you're the Willy.
Yeah,
was that?
It was. Well, I'd like to think I would have gotten 7 of them.
Yeah.
Maybe 8, but I think 3 quartering soldiers, not so relevant anymore. 9 and 10, I often conflate. So yeah, maybe yeah. 9 and 10, I often conflate. So I like to think I would have gotten 7 or 8. I like to think my con law professor Benton Becker, may he rest in peace, from the University of Miami, would have been on my shoulder, very pissed as I struggled with 2 or 3 of them. But Alfred just took over. He just rattled them off. It was quite. I remember the eyebrows raised on Albert Krieger at the end of the 10th Amendment.
if Alfred wasn't able to do it, you might have gotten a devastating, one of Albert's
devastating.
So good. So you get Albert to come on, which is a great get. But one of the things that really surprised me when I was watching the series is you also got the mock jury trial footage. And that is really sensitive, confidential stuff. And I was sort of shocked when I saw that pop up on the screen. I don't know if you can tell us how you got that.
Yeah. So,
go ahead, Bill.
In 2018, 11, was it? We did an interview with Ocean Drive magazine right after we had started working on this project. And we talked about Willy and Sal and Los Muchachos as a labor of love, a real passion project for us. And little did we know that in federal prison, Sal Magluta had a subscription to Ocean Drive magazine, where he read this article. And as someone says in the documentary, there may be 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but in Miami, there's only 1 or 2 degrees of Willy and Sal. And so
Right.
people reached out to me and said, Sal read the article and he'd love to talk with you about it. And we became pen pals for a time. I found myself at his parents' home in Westchester, his mother making me cafecito, feeding me pastelitos, and going through family photo albums of Sal from his childhood in Cuba through the offshore powerboat racing days into the 90s. And just this was as a result, incidentally, this wasn't quick. This was as a result of years of correspondence and Sal wanting to help us get it right and have access to materials to be able to tell the story. And at some point down that road, we find ourselves in a storage unit, a walk-in storage unit, floor to ceiling, 20 years worth of legal records, Sal's personal archive of documents, transcripts, videotapes, trial exhibits, audio tapes, like, surveillance audio
Jackpot.
and video. Just, it was extraordinary. And amongst the boxes and boxes and boxes of videotapes, VHS videotapes, were the mock juries. And so, and we knew what we were looking at relatively, like almost immediately. We didn't realize there had been 3 mock juries. But again, when you have the kinds of resources that we discussed they expended on this trial, this was quite a find. And again, you could see they recreated the entire trial. I mean, they had written an opening statement for the U.S. Attorney's Office. They had they'd presented witnesses. It was an extraordinary document and video, no less, which is of course what we're looking for. As Alfred said, this is a visual medium, and when you have A-roll, which usually makes up a talking head interviews in a documentary, the question becomes, what is your B-roll? What are you seeing? You got to bring the receipts. You need archival materials and evidence and documents and photographs and videos, and this is how we came to obtain that.
And why wouldn't Sal talk to you? Why couldn't you get Sal if he's willing to give you all this stuff? Could you talk to Sal through the phone and record that, or no?
Yeah, that was considered. And I think that Billy had several conversations with Sal that we were talking about how to make that happen. But obviously, being out in Florence, Colorado is the most restrictive prison in the country. And Sal's time on the phone and what he was allotted was very short. He was obviously calling and staying in touch with family during this period. My understanding is that since Timothy McVeigh, on the eve of his execution, gave an interview to 60 Minutes, that was broadcast, that had infuriated, I think, a lot of members of Congress. And there was a big crackdown after that at the Bureau of Prisons on-camera interviews for inmates. In fact, I don't believe there's been a single one conducted in a federal institution since. Bernie Madoff, I think, had participated in a podcast in much the same way that you just described by doing phone calls. But because the McVeigh thing had angered so many people, it's almost impossible. It's up to, of course, to the warden's discretion. But wardens don't want to inconvenience themselves or the institution or compromise the safety or security, obviously. And so, interview requests are just normally turned down at federal prisons almost in their entirety.
Yeah, it's too bad. So the dream team, Roy, Albert, Marty, Scott Srebnick, lots of great lawyers involved. And the case involves so many snitches, I think like 26 snitches in the first trial. And from back in the day, I remember the coverage was basically the defense lawyers crushing these witnesses every day. I mean, absolutely annihilating them. Is that the sense that you guys got from making the movie? Is that on sort of a day-to-day basis during this long, long trial that the defense was scoring lots of points, or were these witnesses holding up?
Well, I think, so you have to understand the 91 60-60 case. The case is really, it's a continuing criminal enterprise case. So it covers from 1978 to 1991. the thrust of the defense, there was two. Well, first of all, it was a statute of limitations defense that, yes, Willy and Sal were big time drug traffickers in 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83. But just outside of the statute of limitations is where they ceased their drug trafficking. And to buttress that claim, these guys are on ESPN racing powerboats. They're internationally known sportsmen. If you are a drug trafficker, there's no chance you're going to be on ESPN bringing all this attention to yourself. So that was kind of because there was no powder found. There was no, a stash houses seized full thousands of kilos or millions of dollars in cash found. This was a case that the government had that was built upon the testimony of cooperating witnesses and a lot of circumstantial evidence surrounding their wealth. That was the other part of the government's case was the massive amount of wealth and two guys who hadn't generated any W-2 income since 1978. One of my favorite details that didn't make it in the doc from the original trial is their accountant had been called to testify, who had filed something called a Fifth Amendment tax return on their behalf, which I had never heard of. But apparently in 1981, 1982, because it is a crime not to file a tax return, right? It's prima facie, you either do or you don't. If you don't file a tax return, that's a crime. So the tax returns were filed, but were left blank, and a note was attached that answering or filling this document out would incriminate myself, and so I plead the Fifth Amendment, and so there is going to be no information filed on this tax return. So that was something that I really got a big kick out of, just in terms of the chutzpah of the defense of that. But that was the defense. So the other part of the case had to do, as far as the government was concerned, were these ledgers that were found when Sal was arrested for Gorse. And the ledgers allegedly documented drug trafficking from, I think, 1988 to 1991. So obviously falling within the statute of limitations. And those ledgers were extremely dangerous to the defense because obviously they were predicating their defense on snitch testimony. Yeah, whatever these guys said they did back in 78, 79, sure they did it, but they weren't doing that within the past 5 or 6 years or 5 years since the indictment. The ledgers were a huge problem. Those ledgers, those were initially on a Fourth Amendment motion, were suppressed by Judge Moreno, and then the government appealed and went all the way to the Supreme Court. That's one of the reasons why, though they were arrested in 91, October of 91, they didn't go to trial until October 95. That appeal went all the way to the Supreme Court. And eventually the ledgers were allowed to be introduced to trial. But that, I think, would, if you had talked to the defense attorneys, would probably be the biggest obstacle because that was their statute of limitations defense. So instead, they pivoted to this idea that all these guys are jumping on the bus and they are looking for deals. And because, as Billy pointed out, they had so many investigators and they had so much time to research, they were pulling sentencing transcripts from these witnesses from 2 crimes ago, and 3 crimes ago. And so they had all of the documentation on all of the witnesses, on everything that these people had done in their entire lives. And they were able to destroy them.
It's and I think from talking to the to some of the jurors, they were not entirely persuaded by the witnesses. They did find the cross-examinations withering, and they had discounted the vast majority of the testimony, but for maybe 1 or 2 of the cooperating witnesses that they found to be persuasive. So I think the idea, and I think probably to an extent, some of the criminal defense attorneys are probably they're probably bummed about the jury tampering for several reasons. Not the least of which is that they didn't really get it. They themselves didn't get a fair shake to see how this jury actually may have voted without the tampering.
I think that's right, Bill. Yeah, because I think the defense lawyers really on a day-to-day basis believed they were winning the case. And that's why you saw some of the different reaction between, the government who could not understand this verdict and the defense lawyers who, although surprised, I think really believed that they were beating these witnesses up pretty good.
Krieger was cleared 20 plus years later when we interviewed him. You see him at the end of episode 3, spoiler alert. He says about the government in that trial, even knowing, of course, what happened later, even in hindsight, he says they got their asses kicked. I mean, that's and he believes that to this. And he was very proud of the fact that I think some of those cross-examinations, some of his in particular, were taught in law school. classes. He believed that they were devastating, devastating.
And they were. I think one of the other issues that really bugs a lot of lawyers is so much was made about these guys getting paid. And the government was really upset about it, about the lawyers getting paid. Of course, when snitch lawyers get paid, the prosecutors don't seem to mind all that much. They seem to be okay with one of the snitch lawyers getting money to have their client testify against Willy and Sal. It's when you want to fight that the prosecutors get bent out of shape about money going to the fighting lawyers.
Well, I think I think the lawyer
is that a question?
It's a discussion, Billy.
I would say, listen. I think that your profession, David, as you know, does not typically poll very highly with the American public in terms of regard and perhaps
we're not winning friends.
Exactly. But I think that there's a principle involved that Albert, I think, did very, very well. I forget if it was during opening or closing. And of course, as most of your audience will kind of have a variation on this, I'm sure, as you guys all do, and women all try cases. But what I found as a layman just particularly persuasive is Albert saying, look, if I were to go out and offer a guy on the street who I know to have some good information and truthful information, I offer him $5 to come in and testify, I'm guilty of bribery. I can go to prison for that. The government can grant somebody something priceless, their freedom. And a lot of times during the case, it was kind of dropped directly on Chris Clark's head. The attorneys kept saying that over and over. And I think they partially played on Clark's age. I think Clark was 33, 34 at the time. And of course, the defense attorneys were much more experienced. Obviously Pat Sullivan's at the table, second chair, but the defense attorneys made a point just of pointing at Chris Clark and saying, only Chris Clark separates you from another 20 years sitting in prison. Isn't that so? And gosh, I mean, that is just fundamentally, just to the layman, a very persuasive statement. In terms of what your incentive is to come in and testify.
And I will say, and I don't know how common this is, obviously the point that they were making that these guys had no legitimate means of income, yet led this lavish lifestyle. That was the thing. And it was not dissimilar in the Miguel Moya, the subsequent Miguel Moya trial. It really seems to be this creepy game of class warfare on the part of the prosecutors, where essentially they're, have a bunch of working class jurors who couldn't even manage to get themselves out of jury duty, guilty as charged.
We won't get into that, Billy.
Who are sitting there? It's another podcast.
Go to the Fifth Amendment on that.
Yeah. So, but here they're showing. Look at these guys. Convict them because they had money. Convict them because they spent lavishly. Convict them because they have more money than you do, never paid tax. I mean, again, that's either a crime or they're really playing on the emotions of working class people who are sitting there in a jury box going, yeah, fuck these guys, for having all this money. But yet at the same time, they had a lot of difficulty beyond a reasonable doubt. This is according to the jurors, kind of drawing a straight line from this money to drug trafficking, to actual cocaine.
Right. You guys talk about defense lawyers not making lots of friends and not being the most popular. One of the things that was very unpopular was the ad that was taken out in the Champion in Prison Life. And you guys talk a lot about it in the series. I have to say, I get it, why people were upset about it. But if the government's theory was that Willy and Sal, mostly Sal, ordered the murders, right? If that's the government's theory, then the ad did not lead to the hits. And so, Sal knew who all the witnesses were. The government, of course, goes through every piece of paper, email, text message, beep, paper. They're allowed to do that. Nobody complains. If the defense tries to get information about who the witnesses are, people freak out. So did that ad cross the line? I mean, was that a real ethical issue in your guys' mind? I mean, I'm interested in your opinion on it.
Well, I think there's two parts, because obviously there's first is the ad in the Criminal Defense Lawyers magazine, and then there's the ad in the prison magazine. So I would say that maybe one would create maybe less of a perception of a problem than another. But you're right. And what this is born out of course, is the idea that defendants would be able to kind of match the resources of the federal government, and the feds not being used to that. There was a lot of also, and again, I don't want to go too far afield on this, because it's my own just kind of personal sense of reading a lot of this and having studied this case. But there seem to be a lot of head games being played here. The defense attorneys seem very, very sophisticated in their approach and their tactics. And I think with the combination of the paralegals and the private investigators and this army of investigators that the defense had in this case, that it really made the prosecution, kind of just constantly looking behind them and looking to see what the defense was doing and what they were up to. There was a guy at one point, there was an investigation because the U.S. Marshals were being photographed coming in and out, or how they were escorting prisoners. There was a lot of controversy. So a lot of it seems to be kind of almost a psychological head game in some ways, that the defense was playing to psych out the prosecution in some ways, in terms of how they were making their inquiries and how they were treating some of these potential witnesses or cooperators, and how they were spreading the word. So, was it effective? I mean, as Billy said, I think that we all would have really liked to have seen what would have happened with a true level playing field here, because I think it very well could have. But to get your specific question about whether it's ethical or not, again, I'll leave that to the experts. I'm not going to make a judgment on whether it's ethical. I think as a civilian looking at it, like I said, I think you could probably make an argument that the ad in prison life is of a magnitude different than maybe taking out an ad in a criminal defense.
Forget
journal.
the experts. I want to hear if Billy thinks it's unethical.
Bill?
I think that the distinction is important. There wasn't one ad. There were two ads, and there were two ads in two separate periodicals. And I understand that they were looking for information, but the flip side of your argument, David, that you said kind of flies in the government's theory of the homicides, that sort of flies in the face of this being a hit list, is that an alternate theory was that because there were Colombian hitmen who were, as you know, subsequently arrested, it became a struggle to trace any of them back to Falcone or Magluta. But the idea, or the alternate theory of the homicides, was that perhaps the Colombians, the suppliers for Willy and Sal, in an effort unbeknownst to them, but to protect them and to perhaps prevent Willy and Sal from identifying them, or whatever the case may be, basically went freelance, kind of went, decided to dispatch with these witnesses independent of Willy and Sal, but to indirectly help them and themselves. If that's the case, then the ad would have been very useful, I guess, in identifying who some of those people were. And in fact, some of those people who were not in custody, but who were out and about, did end up dead.
Yeah. There are so many offshoots to the case, the murder investigations, obviously, and you talked about conflicts. I guess I didn't tell one conflict at the beginning, which is I represented Yubi Ramirez, who, great story. It should be episode 7, I think. Accused, convicted, and sentenced to life, and then we got her sentence reduced to time served of 10 years. One of the offshoots that was amazing to me is the whole Moya bribery case. And, the guy gets a hung jury in trial number 1. I mean, talk about a punch to the gut for the government. I mean, his defense is an only in Miami defense. I'll let you guys describe it. And then the jury hangs. It's unbelievable.
Well, I'll let Alfred tell the defense, but one of my favorite stories from Paul McKenna is during deliberations, everybody gets gathered back in the courtroom because a note has come from the jury foreperson. The note was simply, help with an exclamation point. That was the entirety of the note I can only imagine the judge having to call everybody back in. We have a note from the jury. We have this whole, and that is the four corners of the note. HELP exclamation point. I mean,
I love it. I got to get that framed for my office.
A criminal defense lawyer once told me that if you were going to be indicted for a crime and your intent is to go to trial, there is no better district to go to trial in than the Southern District of Florida, because you will have a jury pool who will be much more skeptical, I think, than perhaps other places in the country towards the United States government's take on allegations of a crime. In this case, this is one of those stories that you just kind of shake your head. To me, this is if you ask me kind of what's my favorite nugget of Miami-dom in this entire story, it is the first day, the opening statements of Moya's first trial. So the feds mount a case, obviously begin investigating the jury, and they notice pretty quickly that Miguel Moya, who is a ramp mechanic at MIA making $30-something thousand a year, all of a sudden is spending a lot of money buying properties and boats and going on trips and gambling and yada yada. My favorite piece of evidence there about his spending patterns that they were examining is that, like any normal working guy, every week or two he'd go to the ATM machine, like the same ATM machine, and take out some spending money, like $200 cash. Well, after the trial, he stopped. He never went to the ATM like ever again. He obviously didn't. And again, it started to make me think about like sort of my own patterns in just behavior, and wondering like, what would that tell someone about me, or what it told the FBI about Miguel Moya is he didn't need the cash from the ATM because he's had plenty of it.
So that's why I love what McKenna says. Like, they proved the money part, so we had to sort of beat the Zen defense. We have to accept the money, right? Ole. But his defense was I mean, I love it.
So Moya had a cousin, Ray Perez, who was a Miami police officer back in the 80s, and ends up getting indicted in one of the Miami River Cops cases, kind of a satellite case, the Miami River Cops case, for drug trafficking. And the defense on the first day of the opening statement is, yes, we have something to admit to the jury and the world that we're not proud of. Miguel Moya spent this money, and this was not money because he was a corrupt juror taking a bribe from Willy and Sal. This was money that his corrupt cop cousin, Ray Perez, had made trafficking cocaine back in the 80s. And it just so happens, statute of limitations has just expired. And finally, the family can start spending the ill-gotten gains from his cousin, who was a police officer's cocaine trafficking in the 1980s, not from him being a corrupt juror taking a payoff. It is, I say this all, it's one of those things that in Cincinnati or Phoenix would never fly. But like Jim DeFeedy says, in Miami, some of the jurors kind of look at each other and say, oh, okay, oh, sure, that makes sense. I could see that. That's sure, why not? And they hung the jury. And of course, the kicker of the whole story is that not only, and we can prove that this happened because there is a safe that was installed in the floor of the Moya family's old house. So they get a warrant and they go to the old house where new people are living, and they take a jackhammer and they
Can you just imagine? Can you imagine the pounding on the door of your house, and in comes the feds? They say, we have a warrant. We're going to drill open your kitchen floor. Imagine these poor people standing there while the government is just drilling up the floor of their kitchen. But this is the kind of thing that would be absurd in a Carl Hiaasen novel. You wouldn't believe it.
It's unbelievable. Honestly, you could do a 6-part series on that trial. I mean, it really, it's so good. And then, okay, so the jury hangs. He goes to trial number 2. Second trials are always bad for the defense. They never go well. I mean, it's almost impossible to win a second trial, as we've seen in this series and many other cases. And of course, Moya goes down in trial number 2, and he gets 20 years. I mean, he gets the same sentence that Willy Falcone gets. Come on, 20 years for getting bribed seems like too much, no?
He volunteered the 20 years.
Okay.
Judge King picked right up on it and said, all right, you asked for it, you got it. Look, I certainly think, and though they've never kind of said so to us, I certainly think that the feds expected that Moya would flip at that point, and that he would become the chief witness against Sal in what became 99-583, and probably could have gotten, maybe if not a get out of jail free card, certainly wouldn't have done 18, 17 and a half, 18, whatever he ended up doing, if he had agreed to testify. But it just goes to show you how frustrated the feds must have been at that point that they couldn't flip it, and that he did serve all that time. And once again, I think it shows, like Billy said, the 1 to 2 degrees of Willy and Sal in this community, that even at that point they reached far and wide into Miami, and I think Moya was scared.
I think it exemplifies the term trial penalty is what I think it does. I mean, I just think that, and I believe had he cooperated, and his attorney says as much, that he would have gotten no jail time. I really believe that. I mean, he could have gotten 2 years, 5 years, something. But I believe it would have amounted to little to no jail time. I think the government was that anxious at that moment in time to nail Willy and Sal, and more importantly, to tie them somehow to the jury tampering, which honestly, I think even in Moya's second trial, from what I recall, they weren't really able to do necessarily. It wasn't, the government still didn't really have an answer to the question of how did Willy and or Sal get to this guy, and how ultimately was he paid off, and who was responsible for that.
Nor do they know exactly how much he was paid. They managed to create some totals based on bank activity and so forth, and purchases of things somewhere in the range of $500,000. But they were never able to put an exact number on it, and nobody was ever prosecuted on the other side for delivering the money or actually being involved in the commission of the bribe.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Marilyn Bonachea. So, in my world, she's known as the villain of the case. In watching the movie, I think she goes back and forth.
What side are you on again, David?
Yeah. No. I'm on the side of, reasonable doubt, Billy. That's the side I'm on the side of reasonable doubt. But I couldn't tell if she was the hero or the villain of the series. And you speak to different people and you get different answers. Twitter seems to have quite a number of answers about it. If you see the way the cops got to her ledgers, to me, they're the villains. They made up this whole thing to get her stopped, right? They say she was speeding because it was raining out. She was under the speed limit, but because of the conditions she was speeding. Then they say they smell marijuana. I mean, give me a break. They do all of this, machinations to get into her trunk and get to the ledgers. We know that they were making this up just to get the ledgers, and we sort of turn away and have a blind eye towards it. Are we okay with that?
Well, I think that was heavily litigated, the suppression of that. Well, I'm sorry, it wasn't, because Sal, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that Sal was, because he could not litigate that because he was not a party to the stop.
It's not his car. So
Right.
He has in what we call no standing to litigate it.
Right.
So she, the bad stop is sort of ignored because she cooperates.
Right. And of course, the feds were tipped off that she was transporting these ledgers. That's how the stop happened. I mean, they knew that she was moving these ledgers from her home to the attorney's office. So this was something that they were tipped off to. And you're right. I think, created some pretext for that stop. I think it's Sergeant Fielder says, yes, we smelled marijuana back when that was illegal. So I'm sure that is that is one of those things, one of the tools in the toolbox that is no longer available, perhaps, but in a substantial way. But yeah, I mean, look, that's the turning point of the whole story, is once they get it. Well, that, and then being able to translate what is actually in those ledgers. But Marilyn obviously preserved those ledgers because she believed that it was protection for her if she were to ever get in trouble. But that was the turning point of the case for sure. And you're right. I guess through that quirk of how it happened, there was no standing to get those thrown out or suppressed, like there was the effort to get the Lagorce ledgers suppressed. I think it was Albert Krieger who told us, maybe it didn't make the doc, but so whenever Sal gets pulled over, Sal got arrested, all these cases, he keeps ledgers like he's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Like this guy has ledgers and ledgers and ledgers. And geez, if you're doing this kind of conduct, why do you have these ledgers? But Sal is a businessman. And so, it's ultimately the ledger, not his own, but Maryland's that took him down.
I think this incident actually speaks to Alfred's earlier point that studying this case and these cases, plural, I should say, has been a bit of a law school education, because who knew that you could kind of trim a weed and salvage the fruit from the poisonous tree? I mean, there's been a lot of those moments where our kind of cursory, undergraduate understanding of the law and the Constitution gets turned on its head when you realize what is in fact considered legal or constitutional.
Right. Alfred mentioned before that the defense lawyers were playing head games. I think it was much more the prosecutors who were doing the strong arm tactics. I mean, look at the whole incident with Sal's father and son. I mean, to me, and Billy did such a great job getting Pat to admit this. I mean, he admits on camera that he was using sort of, I think he said strong arm. I don't remember the exact expression.
Hardball, playing hardball. He said that was me and the U.S. Attorney's Office playing hardball.
I mean, that's an understatement, but at least I think you got a glimpse of what the prosecutors were doing. I mean, to threaten an 80-year-old father and a son with prosecution in order to get somebody to plead guilty, just have your trial. I mean, what are you so afraid of? Try the case if you want to. Why do you have to threaten the father and son? And it didn't work. I mean, Sal called the bluff. I mean, for better or for worse, I would argue for worse. Called the bluff, and the hardball did not work.
It was a scorched earth tactic. I mean, all their tactics by that point in that stage of the case were scorched earth. It's a little disturbing to think that the U.S. government would do what is tantamount to torturing your son or your father in front of you to get you to submit, which is essentially what this was kind of tantamount to doing, if you believe that. On the flip side of the coin, there was the belief on the part of the FBI, the DEA, the IRS, the DOJ, that Sal Magluta was public enemy number one. That was their perception, that was their stance, and that's what was dictating their tactics. They also believed that he had somehow single-handedly tainted and corrupted the entirety of the criminal justice system. Lawyers being arrested, law enforcement having been paid off, prison guards, and now jurors, that there was a real effort to make an example out of him. I would say, in which case, if that's your intent, then make an example out of him. Leave his family alone. As Ed Shohat says, we're just waiting for them to charge the parrot, and the dog.
Great line. Such
next
a great line.
In this case. Yeah. And so, I mean, I can see the perspectives from either side here. I think that, again, if you are a criminal, if you're responsible for breaking the law, I would like to see, ideally, for me to feel like the criminal justice system is truly functioning, I'd like to see the government make their case beyond a reasonable doubt against the defendant, against the alleged criminal.
I agree with that. I think they should do it fairly. And so that's the question. The other, there were so many other head games and strong arm tactics used. One of them that I don't think gets enough play, you guys mentioned it, is the security just getting into the courtroom. Now, people might not think that's a big deal, but it does send a message to the jury about what's going on here. I mean, it was unprecedented security to get in. Alfred, I think you went to some of the 99 trial, right?
Yeah, this is 99-583. This trial is, I think, May of 2002. I was going, so I'm about 21, 22 at the time. And I went with our third partner, David Sitkin, and I went down just to watch some of the trial. In fact, the day that we went was the day that Tony Posada's wife was testifying about going out to her car and starting the the van in the morning and it blowing up. And she was furious. I mean, just the look that she gave to Magluta rather, it was noticed throughout the courtroom. But I remember going in, you had to present your driver's license. The jury, first of all, was sequestered and anonymous. And that trial went on for months and months. These jurors living in a hotel and totally anonymous. To get into the courtroom, you had to present a driver's license, which is unheard of. To walk into a public courtroom in the United States, have to show and it was recorded. You showed your driver's license. They recorded who was coming in, who was coming out. And it was
in a ledger, actually. There was a ledger.
Yeah, in a ledger. They had a ledger book. And I remember during one break, Dave and I had walked out, or maybe it was lunch. I think it might have been lunchtime, and court had adjourned, and we're standing in the lobby, and we're waiting for the elevators, and the elevator doors open. Dave and I get on, and behind us, the prosecution team gets on. And so Dave and I and some agents, Dave and I are all of a sudden on the elevator with Pat Sullivan and a bunch of agents. And, we're 22 years old, and what are we doing at this trial? And, what are we saying? So Pat turns to us at one point, and it's a long ride down. I think it might have been on the 12th. I forget what floor it was on, but we had enough time in the elevator going down. Pat turns to Dave and I says, oh, are you guys law school students? And I look at him and I just go, no. And I didn't say anything else. And there was just a long silence. Well, I didn't know how to explain what our interest was there.
No, but also you and Dave, when you went into the courtroom, you sat behind the defense.
That's right. We didn't really know the protocol. We sat on the defense side because I was child.
Like a wedding. You have to pick what side you're on.
Exactly. And we had gone there. One of the reasons that we had become so familiar with this case, I've told the story a few times, but I've been hearing the story since I was in 8th grade, because I was in 8th grade, 1991. And my best friend at the time, Joe Schuster, his father, Neil, was one of Sal's attorneys very early on in the first case, and then became one of the trial attorneys in the second.
More conflicts.
So I had gone and sat beside, well, there's Neil in the courtroom, and I'm just going to sit on the side he's on. That's all. I didn't think anything of it. But Pat certainly took notice of Dave and I there that day, and we certainly didn't feel like we could say we were documentary filmmakers at the time or anything. So we just said no, and they must have checked our driver's license when we left that day.
They definitely ran you that night. They ran you and Dave and saw your record. So despite all of that.
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. For the record, that's David Sipkin, our third partner at Raconteur, who executive produced and edited Cocaine Cowboys, the Kings of Miami.
And it was awesome editing. And Dave's great. And despite all the security, strong arm tactics, everything else, Sal wins again. And no jury was bribed this time. I mean, he is found not guilty of all the murders. He is found guilty of 8 checks going to his lawyers. But I mean, this was a murder case, I think, as Richard Clue, one of the lawyers, says. This was a murder case, and he walks on the murders. It was an enormous victory, everybody thought initially. It turns out not so much, because as Billy talked about, there's this trial tax. And in Sal's case, even though Willy gets ultimately 20 years, Sal gets 200 years and is sentenced based on acquitted conduct. One of the things that most people don't understand, like if you ask my mom, can you be sentenced for something you've been found not guilty of? She would say, of course not. And that's what 99% of people would say. In this case, we learn, no, the Supreme Court has said in a case called Watts that you can be sentenced even for things that you've been found not guilty of. That can't be right. That can't be fair, can it, Billy? I mean, we're going to allow that?
Well, first, to your point, there was no jury shenanigans. This was an anonymous and sequestered jury from the very beginning, from voir dire. And so there was no jury shenanigans. This jury considered the evidence and found and acquitted Sal of the vast majority of the crimes, including ones you would argue are the most significant. If there are murder charges in an indictment, you would say this is a murder case. You wouldn't say we're worried about money laundering. You're saying we're worried about these 3 witness tampering charges, which are the homicides, which would have gotten Sal, three lifetimes essentially in prison. When he is convicted of writing 8 checks, he's also acquitted, I should say, of the cash money laundering as well, and all that ledger money that was moving all around town. $7+ million in cash alone in the Maryland Bonachea ledgers. He was only convicted of writing these 8 checks from the Bank of Israel to his attorneys to pay for his defense. And What he got was 20 years per check, not concurrent, but I think the attorneys would have said it was rather unprecedented to hear a consecutive sentence on that, because the judge was able to consider acquitted conduct, which I would say, people ask this question a lot, what was the most surprising thing that you learned working on this project? And I'd say that was it. I'd say that flies in the face of everything we understand from elementary school forward, from civics classes through present day about our mythological, wonderful criminal justice system. The idea innocent until proven guilty, and once proven guilty by a jury of your peers, you are sentenced and punished for the crimes that you were convicted of, not for those that you were acquitted of. Why have a trial at all then? Why waste the jury's time? And I think Sal's attorneys articulate it quite effectively. They basically say to believe that Sal deserves that sentence based on the crimes for which he was convicted, not what you think he did, or not what we quote unquote we all know he did, or what the media claims or the government claims that he did, but what they actually proved beyond a reasonable doubt, that he's worse than Al Capone. Because much like Al Capone, Al Capone, who was never convicted of murder, of racketeering, of gambling, of rum running, he was convicted of tax evasion. He was sentenced to 10 years in Alcatraz, served out about 8, and retires to a mansion in Palm Island in Miami Beach, where he dies of syphilis because Miami. And meanwhile, Sal is serving 200 years under a mountain in Florence, Colorado, in the Alcatraz of the Rockies, with the most violent offenders in the history of federal jurisprudence, of terrorists, in fact. And is that the most just outcome, considering how this actually did shake out? And I think it's a tough argument to make. And as such, you have a bipartisan effort in the Senate. You have Republicans and Democratic senators who are sponsoring a bill to explicitly outlaw the ability of judges to sentence on acquitted conduct.
See, Billy, you asked me before what side I was on. I think you're now on my side. I mean, that was beautiful. I think you've joined the good side here, and that was a beautiful.
Listen, I just listen. I want it to be the justice system that we all believe that it is. I want it to be the justice system that we are taught that it is. I want it to be fundamentally fair. I would rather see the guilty go free than one innocent person suffer one unjust day in prison. And I think that Sal Magluta was convicted of crimes. There's no doubt about that. He owes a debt to society because of that. But I think we also have to be fundamentally just and fair in meting out a punishment.
So let's talk about that punishment. And Alfred, I'll turn to you on the punishment, because Billy mentioned that he's in Florence under the mountain in the Supermax. I mean, can you tell us from speaking to Sal and the family what those conditions are like?
Well, they're just horrendous. 23 hours a day in your cell, recreate, all meals served through a slot door, limited human contact, if
torture.
Any, torture. A very short recreation period, very limited contact with the outside world. I mean, Sal was in Marion, another terrible federal penitentiary, and in his cell with the cellmate, there was a cellular phone found, and so that's why he eventually got transferred to Florence. I think he's actually been back and forth a couple times now, but it's torture. 60 Minutes has done a couple pieces on Florence, Colorado, on the Supermax prison and its effect on human beings. Amnesty International's talked about it. So there's been a lot of reporting on it. Marshall Project as well, but it continues to exist, obviously, as a place to put our worst people. El Chapo's out there now too, obviously. I would like to go back for a second. David, I'd like, maybe just for the benefit of the audience, actually for my benefit more than anything else, I'd like to understand the Supreme Court decision on acquitted conduct. Can you, in a nutshell, and I'm sorry to turn the tables and interview you here, but how did the Supreme Court, first of all, what year is this case? What's the makeup of the court? And what is the verdict? What is the justification for this nuance of the law.
Yeah, it was a decision back in the mid 90s, and it was a very split decision. I believe it was a 5-4 decision. And what the court said is, listen, at sentencing, things aren't decided beyond a reasonable doubt. They're decided by a preponderance of the evidence. So judges only need to find, by 50.01% that something happened, not beyond a reasonable doubt. And so if that is found at sentencing by a judge, that's enough to increase someone's sentence, so long as it's not above the statutory maximum. So how did the judge get around it? In this case, she said, well, for each count, the statutory maximum is 20 years, and I'm just going to stack them as high as I can get. So that's I don't agree with it, but that's the Supreme Court.
So why is the judge doing any fact finding? Didn't the jury do that already? Why is there any preponderance or beyond a reason? Why is there any standard of proof for the judge at that point? The jury told the judge what the defendant's guilty of. So you guys should be lawyers, because that has been exactly the challenge to this Supreme Court case called Watts in the years since. And a lot of the justices have said, we should re-examine this. And Congress, of course, has taken it up, as you say, and the Supreme Court, in a number of opinions, even Scalia before his death said we should re-examine this issue. This isn't right, and it never has. Cert's never been granted. The Supreme Court has never taken it. But there's been, obviously, of all the Supreme Court cases that are currently good law, even more than all the crazy criticism of Roe. This case has been criticized by the right and left. I mean, it is roundly considered the worst Supreme Court case that's currently good law across the board by both sides.
Just to take a contrarian position here on it, obviously there's particularly from the criminal defense bar, a lot of consternation over the years about mandatory minimums and tying judges' hands, and we should give judges more discretion. That's always been, I think, kind of the position of the criminal defense bar when it comes to mandatory minimums. But here's a case, obviously, where the judge's discretion oversteps as far as, I guess, the criminal defense bar is concerned. And I would agree with that. But it basically, this is too much discretion for a judge, I suppose, is the position.
Well, right. I think we're typically okay with discretion of a court when there's a plea of guilty and there has to be some fact finding by the judge at a sentencing where there's no jury, as Billy mentioned, but where there has been fact finding, where the jury has come out and said, we find that they haven't proven their case on X, Y, and Z. It just strikes the wrong way.
It sounds fundamentally un-American, I think, to anybody who 9 out of 10 people on the street would say that.
Right. And there, by the way, there used to be a whole line of cases where the jury would say, we're not going to recommend death, in death penalty cases. And then the judge could overrule that. And the Supreme Court said, no more of that. We're not going to allow that anymore. In a lot of ways, this is the same thing, right? So where a jury says, we're not going to find that Sal committed these murders. And the judge says, no, I am going to find it. I think that's the problem with Watts and what happened here. And so now we're left with Sal serving this long sentence. I know he started this IG page, Instagram page, his family did, and he's making a push, I think, through a motion for compassionate release. I'm not sure. Do you guys cover that at the end of the movie? I don't remember if you cover the compassionate release stuff.
No, but my understanding is that in the Southern District of Florida, that I think almost 20% of those have been granted. I think 1 in 5 have been granted the compassionate release motions. I think we are one of the districts that has the highest amount of motions like that granted. Obviously, this one is pending, so I guess we'll find out. But if statistics point the way, it seems like Magluta would have a better chance in this district than any other, at least according to the latest stats.
And the way that it shakes out is that ultimately Willy pled guilty to, I believe, money laundering charges. Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah. So similar crimes to what Sal was ultimately convicted and sentenced for. And he, as you pointed out, David, got 20 years, served about 17 or 18 of those. And so if you're going to talk about, has Sal paid his debt to society? Is he an ongoing threat? I would say, have to say no more so than Willy, who is out and enjoying his retirement right now.
So you guys are making the movie. You've covered Willy's brother sort of being on the lam and not getting caught. And then, it must have happened while you guys were making the movie that they catch him, right? You guys must have fallen out of your chair.
It happened during an interview.
Tell
Bill,
me
tell
what
the
happened.
story.
We're rolling. The camera was rolling, and it actually, for a time, in the rough cut of episode 6, we actually use the footage. We're interviewing Bobby Wells, who was hired on as a young associate for Albert Krieger essentially on the eve of Willy and Sal's first trial, in 91, 60, 60. In 94, 95, I think he comes on. And we're interviewing Bobby Wells in a studio, and I get to a question, and I say something, I set it up with, and of course there is still a fugitive in this case, one of the co-conspirators or alleged co-conspirators in the original indictment, Willy's younger brother, Gustavo Tabby Falcone, who has been gone and on the run for 27 years. And from the green room of the studio, you hear Alfred yell, "They got him." You can almost hear like the squeak of the hamster wheel in my brain, just like kind of like just, and I'm like, "I'm sorry, what?" Alfred's like, "Yeah, the marshals just picked him up in Kissimmee, in Orlando this morning." And Bobby Wells, I'll be like, his jaw just hits the floor. And we're all just like, "I'm sorry, what the hell are you talking about?" And it just stops. The whole interview just stops. We all get up, walk into the green room where Alfred is on the computer, and there was the news of Tabby and his wife and his son and his daughter, all of whom had disappeared in 91, actually disappeared in 91, just as the secret indictment was, going to be released, and they were going to go all over town and start to gather up the defendants. They took off and they disappeared for 27 years. The scuttlebutt, the chisme on the streets of Miami always was obviously that they jumped on a jet and skipped the country and were in Spain or Colombia or somewhere. That was always the assumption. Yeah. How do you disappear to Epcot for 27 years?
Well, how did they catch him? How did they get him?
There was a sketch artist who works at the Miami-Dade Police Department named Samantha Steinberg, who apparently had seen us talk about this case or this project and went and checked the last time they updated. She had done, I think, a sketch for America's Most Wanted, one of the age progression ones regarding Tabby. And she said, well, let me just go on and update it. And she started looking through driver's licenses. I guess there's some database where she could kind of match faces or some sort. And she came across one that she thought looked, she's like, wow. She started staring at this face and she's like, this looks like, and it was her research basically and abilities that ended up tipping off the marshals.
So it was you guys are really to blame for it all.
No, I wouldn't say that. No.
It's too bad Tabby didn't go to trial. I mean, we would have all been sitting in the courtroom. How great would that have been for the series?
Well, we went to went to his arraignment, and it was like it was old home week. A lot of the
reunion
reporters. Yeah, it was a reunion for a lot of people. It seemed a lot of agents were there, and
was DeFeed there? Was DeFeed there?
Do you remember seeing DeFeed? I remember seeing a bunch of TV people. Yeah, I don't know
because
that Jim was there.
DeFeedy covered it extensively, but I don't know that he was in the courtroom. I will say that I FaceTimed with Tabby's wife when they first came home. Tabby obviously was in custody. She was reunited with her family for the first time in 27 years. From her younger brother Pedro Rosello, Peggy describes it. Really what his parents went through, and they both passed away while she was gone. And he described his parents as, he's like, when you're waiting, your kids are out at night and you stay up and you wait for them to come home safely. He's like, that was my parents for 25 years.
Wow.
Like waiting for her to come home, and she never did, and their grandchildren never did in their lifetimes, unfortunately. And so she looked relieved. I mean, she looked thrilled. I mean, just smiled from ear to ear, reunited with her family. I can't even imagine the extraordinary anxiety and stress and pressure of living on the lam like that for 27 years. I mean, it's just, what that life and lifestyle must have been like. And especially for the children growing up that way, they were not double digits. They were like 7, 8, 9 years old when they went on the run. And it just must be an extraordinarily stressful life through no fault of their own. Their dad, Tabby was the only fugitive in the case. The wife wasn't indicted. The children obviously were innocent. So just an incredible, but someone describes it in the documentary as he almost had a sense of relief. I think he did. He was ready to face the music, and he pled guilty, and he's doing his time.
And that's not the only guy who got caught and is in jail now. Peggy, after the interview, gets arrested. I mean, unbelievable. You can't make this stuff.
Unbelievable spoiler alert, David. Jesus. I mean, unbelievable
like
spoiler
I said, people
alert.
better watch the people. I hope people have watched by now.
Me too.
My whole world, all the criminal defense lawyers, everybody binged it. In the last couple of days, everybody's been texting and emailing. My world, the people who will be listening to this podcast have all watched it, Billy.
All right. All right. Fair enough.
So this has been great. And thank you guys for doing this. Let me ask one last question for each of you. This has been obviously, I think, the biggest trial in Miami federal court history. Maybe one of the biggest in federal court history in the country. What are the long-term ramifications of a case like this? I mean, it really, for me at least, you used to hear the old stories of criminal defense lawyers and prosecutors having a beer at the end of the day. There was old Sally Russell's on Flagler. That's where everybody used to go. This case really stopped that. I mean, it has been the animosity between the government and defense lawyers from this case has been really crazy. Things are starting to cool off all these years later. I mean, you're starting to see some friendships again, but for a long time, it was really awful, I think. What else have you guys thought of in terms of the effects of this case?
Well, first of all, it's unbelievable to consider this case to be one of the biggest, even in the Southern District. I mean, we tried a head of state here. We tried Manuel Noriega here, which is a pretty unique case in American history. But I think you're right. This was around the time where things started changing in the 90s. And this goes back to the question of how lawyers get paid and, this issue of fees. And we didn't really kind of get into a lot of this. But, I think that while the rules were still being made during this era, there was a lot of tension, and there obviously and a lot of consternation on the part of the criminal defense bar, who felt that they were under attack for just doing their jobs or constitutionally protected jobs, that they should be able to make a living and get paid for their work. And there was we've certainly heard it from a lot of people. I think that's a reason ultimately why some of the defense attorneys did not want to participate and do interviews in the documentary. Yeah. And that tension we have heard about. And everybody points to this case as being the turning point at which trust and relationships and friendships broke down over. And so I think that, the ultimate result of that is perhaps I think that a justice system probably works better when both sides can talk to one another and work things out and have a civil operating criminal defense system between prosecutors and defense attorneys who have to work together over and over and over again. So I think it's unfortunate that happened. I think that though, there's been some cases, again, we didn't talk about it, but certainly the Ben Cuny case, I think probably set some bright line guideposts, in terms of how fees are treated and how lawyers get paid. So perhaps that issue at least might have been put to bed a bit. But I think it's unfortunate. And you're right. I mean, it seems to have been a Cold War that has enveloped the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Criminal Defense Bar in South Florida for almost 20 years now as a result of this. So hopefully, kind of us rehashing it and kind of telling the story from start to finish might put kind of a fine tip on it, and be able to move forward at this point.
It's an adversarial system. I don't think it has to be quite this antagonistic. And I think that was maybe this case was that shift, that line in the sand. And I think Alfred's right. I think ultimately it's justice, and it's the defendants and their rights and their ability to have a just outcome that are the victims here. I think it probably, to an extent, I don't want to compare it to the WWE, but some of trial law and these hearings are performative, but then to be able to kind of step outside the ring so to speak, and to be able to talk as human beings and say, what can we do to come up with the most just outcome here? But for the prosecution to see criminal defense attorneys not simply as advocates for their client, and in fact, constitutionally mandated advocates for their clients, but as adversaries and antagonists in and of themselves, as enemies, that the criminal defense attorneys are enemies rather than advocates for their clients, I think creates a toxicity that rots away at the criminal justice system.
So, Billy, I love the shirt. For those who are just listening, you have a Seahawks shirt on. I need one of those shirts. I need a Seahawks shirt at the end of this. I love it. Love it.
I'd like to say I found it in Sal's storage unit, but I didn't. I did not. I would not have. We only scanned things and digitized them. We put all of everything back in where more or less where we found it. There was no Dewey Decimal System or anything in there, but we left everything where we found. No, this was a custom job. I might know where I could find one for you, though.
I want to thank the boys, Los Muchachos of Miami, for doing this and for backing the podcast. It's been a lot of fun today, and I'm looking forward to episode 7 and 8 of the story, because there's a lot more to tell about this thing.
Yeah, season 2.
Season 2. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
That was really a lot of fun. We could have discussed these cases for many, many hours. And Billy and Alfred should be lawyers in another life, the way they know the law, know the cases and what happened. By the way, Roy Black and Marty Weinberg, 2 of the lead lawyers in the Willy and Sal case, were interviewed in season 1 about different cases, but you might be interested in going back and listening to them. I think you'll find their interviews really interesting as well. So we've done defense lawyers, we've done judges, now we've done movie makers. Don't worry, we're going to get back to defense lawyers in season 4, which we're preparing for now. But this was a whole lot of fun. Please send me your feedback about the podcast. Please subscribe and like it if you can, and leave comments. And I look forward to seeing you all in season 4. Go watch Cocaine Cowboys, the Kings of Miami, if you haven't yet. Talk to you soon. Thanks.